So I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of flour, and 2 tablespoons of water. Okay, 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of water. And I'm just going to stir that really good. I'm already excited about this. And I'm using a no discard method. I wanted it to be as simple as possible. And I don't know what I would do with the discard, so lid on it. I'm not going to tighten it a lot because my other understanding is it needs to be able to breathe a little bit. So we'll just cover that. And I am going to place it beside my little mini egg incubator. It is day 2 for my starter. So I am going to add a little food to it. And 3 tablespoons of water. So that's what it's going to get again today. I'm just ready to bake bread already, y'all. I'm making bread, and I never did. I'm going to cover it loosely, put it back where it was. This is day 1. Still 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of water. I switched to bottled water because I saw a handful of videos that suggested if you have any chlorine in your tap water, it can thwart the process. So to give myself the best odds, I thought, why not just use some bottled water? You know, worst thing that can happen is it'll still turn out the same. These little rubber bands work great to mark the starting point. Over time, I got a little more comfortable with mixing the starter a little thicker. So a little more flour, a little less water. And by this day, by day 3, I started seeing some activity, some bubbling and stuff that I wasn't seeing the first time. One of the things I didn't mention, that first batch of starter I made, I had that lid, that metal lid on the container. And I feel like it was not allowing the starter to breathe too much. But then I switched to coffee filters with a rubber band around it, and that was allowing too much moisture to escape. So again, this has been such a learning experience for me. And I thought, well, let me just use some plastic wrap, or I had these fold and seal Ziploc or sandwich bags that I started using over the top. And at this point, I'm still feeding it like double whatever was in the jar from the previous time. So we're starting to get to a point here where I know I'm not going to be able to fit it all in the jar if I stick with my plan to not discard anything. I'm learning about things I can do with the discard. And even now I have a couple of jars in the refrigerator. They're not full, but I've still been saving the discard. And I've already experimented with that a little bit. I can pull some of that out of the refrigerator and just feed it again and leave it sitting on the counter and create another jar of active starter. So that's going really well. Okay, I finally reached this point though where I knew I was going to have to either discard or divide this starter up. So I got another jar and took some out, put it in the other jar, and then fed both jars. These are the jars that are in the refrigerator full time now. And then I have a separate jar where I pull out a little bit of that to do my starter to make bread. So some nice bubbles there. It's got that, I don't remember what that's called, that liquid on the top, but that doesn't hurt anything. I think some people pour that off. I've been keeping it in there. I feel like it's part of the process, and it just means that I don't add quite as much water. So I had been doing equal parts water and flour, but when I saw that liquid on top, I put a tablespoon less water than flour when I fed it this time. And again, as you can see, the jar is getting really full. This is the second jar, feeding that second jar. And when these start taking off growing, it just becomes really obvious why it's best to discard. I don't want to end up with 30 jars of starter in my refrigerator. Anybody want some starter? You're welcome to come and get some. So this process is simple. You just have to remember to keep it fed so that it won't die. And the signs that it's growing again are that it gets bubbly, and you can start to smell that classic sour smell that makes sourdough. I love that smell. Some people may not like it, but this is again starting to get nice and active, and I was really encouraged at this point because I just never really saw anything that looked promising from that first batch of starter. So I realized I'm gonna have to discard. I just can't fight it anymore, and so I just scooped some out into this empty cottage cheese container and then just threw the whole container away. That makes me feel bad. I don't like to throw food away. And again, I'm learning about things I can do with my discard. So my hope is that over time, I won't have to actually throw stuff away. All right, so now we're at bread making day, at least my first attempt. So I took a couple of tablespoons of the active starter and I'm feeding it. So I'm going to feed it 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of water. At least that's what I'm shooting for. This is my new digital scale. And I do think it's easier to be precise measuring in grams than ounces even. Seems like there's just more increments, so you can really, really hone it down. And this scale, see, I can zero it out after I've added an ingredient and then just start over. So I'm shooting for 25 grams of water, but you'll see here in just a second that I overshoot. But nothing to worry about there. I'm gonna just add a little more flour and then just go by the consistency to decide if it needs more of one or the other. Again, this has a little bit of that active starter in it, so I'm kind of feeding that active starter, and this is what I'm going to use then in my actual bread recipe, because I'm going to use this jar. What comes out of this jar is going to be in the first loaf of bread I make. So I do know now that you kind of want the consistency to be like a thick pancake batter. So I think I've pretty much got that figured out. I like to keep the jar as clean as I can around the sides because it's just so much easier to see if it's growing, if it's rising. in the jar. And again, then these rubber bands are just such a great way to mark the top, mark where it is in the jar so that at a glance you can see how much of it has grown in the jar. So sticking with my sandwich bags over the top, that works so great. If you haven't tried that, try that. And then into the oven, this is going to go, just because it was a little cool in the house, and I only have that oven light on for a little tiny bit of warmth so that it's not sitting out on a cold counter. I totally forgot to record when I was mixing my autolyse, but that consisted of 175 grams of all-purpose flour, 175 grams of whole wheat flour, and 269 grams of water. I let that sit for 30 minutes, and then I added my starter and 7 grams of salt. I just blended this until everything was evenly distributed and incorporated. It is a very wet dough. I knew it would be a wet dough, and what I've learned is that the wetter the dough, the smoother the texture you're going to get. But it is really tricky for first-timers to work with something this wet and sticky. So now that I have it all mixed together, I'm going to let that sit for half an hour before I start working the dough. Okay, so 30 minutes have gone by. I'm going to do the first set of stretches and folds. And these stretches and folds are kind of like exercising the bread, and it's going to help it build strength. It's going to help create the little pockets, the kind of bubbles that you see in a sourdough bread are in part created because of how you work the dough, and it gives the dough, volume so that it can rise and continue to grow using that active starter. So after the first set of stretches and folds, I cover it again and let it sit for half an hour. Then back for round 2 of stretching and folding. And this process is the same each time. I saw some videos that said if you wet your hands, it'll help the dough not stick to your hands so badly. But I almost feel like even with just a tiny bit of water on my hands, it just made the dough even wetter. But for stretching and folding, you just rotate your bowl so that you can stretch and fold each corner edge, each side edge rather, up as far as you can get it and then over. And again, we're just building layers and little places where air can collect. So we'll cover that one, wait another half an hour, then come back and do the third round of stretching and folding. Most of the videos I've watched have recommended that you do 4 sets of stretching and folding, each about a half an hour apart. Now, what I didn't know with this batch was like how much to stretch and fold. Do I just do 1 time around the bowl? Do I do 3 times around the bowl? And I can just tell you already, without you knowing how this ends, that I didn't do it enough. I did not work the dough enough. So it didn't build enough strength. It didn't build enough gluten bonds or whatever those are called. And that makes a huge difference. So we have let it sit for the last little 30-minute session before we're going to do the last stretching and folding. All right, so after that set of stretching and folding, I put mine in the refrigerator for overnight. It was too late at night to be baking bread, and I was encouraged the next morning when I pulled it out and it was bubbly. It had increased in volume a little bit, but first sign that something wasn't right was that it had spread out in the pan or in the bowl so much. So now we're going to start working the dough to get it pre-shaped. I'm going to flour my surface and scoop this dough out. I love seeing those bubbles, and I know that's a good sign to see the bubbles. It's still very, very wet. This dough is so wet. And mine was like a 76% hydration. So some people do it even wetter than this. And maybe if I get good at it one day, I can do it wetter than this. So first step is going to be for me to just kind of spread it out, give myself some surface area to work with. I don't want to pop any bubbles or deflate it, but I just need to create, a bigger piece to work with. And I'll just start kind of folding it over onto itself. Again, it's almost like creating layers when you're doing puff pastry or something. Kind of, again, still sort of stretching and folding as I go. The little bit of flour that I had here definitely was making it easier to work with. And now I'm just going to let it sit on the counter. This is called a bench rest, and I'm just going to let it sit on the counter covered for 30 minutes. There's a lot of resting that happens with dough between sessions of working the dough. And of course I had no proofing bowls or proofing baskets, so I'm just going to use a ceramic dish, and I put a pillowcase in it. I just cut a pillowcase to make a little cloth to put in it. And I did know that you have to be generous with flouring it so that the dough won't stick to the cloth. So I'm putting what I feel like is a lot of flour in this bowl. I guess it's always better to have too much than not enough, right? And I'm trying to make sure that that the flour is sticking along the sides. Now we're going to move our little rested dough in once I have it more in a ball shape, a loaf shape. Since my Dutch oven is round, I'm just going to do a round bowl shape. I do have proofing bowls now, so you'll see those in an upcoming video. And again, we're going to do just a series of like folds. I've seen this technique at a couple of different YouTube channels. Folding it to kind of create layers and air pockets. I know I have to be careful not to deflate it. And it's good that it's sticky because it kind of needs to be able to stick to itself. But what I wasn't good at here was kind of dragging it along the counter effectively so that I could stretch the surface. You need a lot of tension. You need to, like if you're blowing up a balloon, the balloon gets firmer and firmer and firmer the more air you put in it. So dragging it along the counter is one way you kind of create the firm layer on the outside. And I did not master that for sure for this first attempt. So I also know I've got to be sure that I flour it well around the edges, because as it expands, if it's gonna rise, it's gonna come in contact with, more of the cloth higher up along the sides. So I thought I floured it sufficiently, and now we're gonna let it sit and proof. So I let it proof for about 3 hours. And then kind of clumsily got it transferred onto a piece of parchment paper that I'll use to put it in the Dutch oven. Now the Dutch oven has been preheating at 500 degrees at this point. And check this out. So in spite of all the flour I thought I used, it was not enough. This probably should have been my first indicator that this loaf was not going to turn out well, because look at how I'm having to abuse it to peel it off of the pillowcase. So it's not supposed to do like that. But I was this far in the process, and again, every part of it is a learning opportunity. I should have known. I look at it now and think, look how it's spread out. It just didn't keep its shape at all. And then I know those of you that are experienced bread makers are looking at what I'm doing right now and either shaking your heads or laughing or both. I don't have a tool. I do not have a lamb for making cuts. I understand it needs a cut so that the pressure can escape and it can puff up. At this point, I'm still hopeful. I was still trying to think positive that I might still get a risen loaf of bread. So again, my oven is set at 500 degrees. That Dutch oven had been preheating for 45 minutes before I put the bread in it. And here we are with the finished product. As you can see, it didn't rise any more than what you saw when I put it in the pan. The crust is nice and crispy. I'm pleased with the color I got off of the crust. I probably should have brushed away a little more of this flour before I put it in the oven. But again, I'm learning as I go. Everything that didn't turn out like I wanted it to turn out or like it should have turned out taught me something for the next time.